What makes a weapon good? For any endgame hunter, getting the best weapons in the game is the main motivator for hunting deadly monsters in order to receive that top tier loot. But if you break down what makes those weapons so good, you can find weapons rivaling in both damage and viability. For this video, I will be covering Blademaster weapons specifically because I am not a gunner and I don't think I'm qualified to talk about weapons I am unfamiliar with. But with many of the principles I will talk about in the video, they will likely carry over to gunners, just with specific class differences like ammo types and sharpness. Let's get started. If we want to define the best weapon, we need a numerical way of comparing weapons to each other. And the best way to do that is measure how much damage they do, assuming we are using their final forms, meaning we need to take into account the attributes of the weapon that factor into damage. The following qualities affect damage directly during the course of the hunt: raw attack, sharpness, element/status, and affinity. These are ordered by importance. Generally speaking, raw attack defines how viable a weapon is. In the case of this game, the quote-unquote minimum raw attack for a candidate for best weapon is 330. Anything lower becomes unviable regardless of its other stats. Raw attack sets the range of tiers a weapon can be. If it's below 300, most of the time they are gimmick weapons used only for their cheese. If it's above 330, they tend to be very good weapons at full power, but require sharpness or affinity boosting in order to achieve that power. You either have independent weapons that are outperformed in damage, or damage beasts, but are in one or more ways. Problem children needing god charms with full crit upsets on top of sharpness. There's one exception, but I will discuss that later. Sharpness is the second priority because it can move a weapon up or down a tier, but not as drastically as raw attack. If you're comparing two weapons of similar raw, sharpness can cause one or the other to be better, given they have higher sharpness. The first factor is comparing raw attack and sharpness. And going from blue to white and white to purple, raw attack has less of a role the closer two weapons are in their respective values. Sharpness will be the deciding factor. If the difference between two weapons is 10 raw, the lower raw, higher sharpness weapon will always outperform the higher raw, lower sharpness weapon. At this level, the difference between raw attack is negligible, so whichever weapon has higher multipliers will output more damage. But once the difference between raw attack is 20, that gives enough attack for the lower sharpness weapon to surpass the higher sharpness weapon in damage. The second factor is how long is that given sharpness for each weapon. If it has a sliver of purple and then drops down to green, then your damage will be S tier for about 10 hits, then your overall damage will swan dive into the gutter. If you have a decent chunk of sharpness for each level, or a massive chunk of white sharpness, then your overall damage will be higher than the short purple sharpness weapon, needing to resharpen every minute during the course of the hunt. Sharpness length depends heavily on the weapon you are using. If it has a lot of multi-hit combos, then you'll require longer sharpness and less sharpness the less your specific weapon attacks the monster. Element is the third factor because it relies on sharpness and is dependent on the matchup. Functionally, it works like raw attack in how it bumps a weapon up a tier, albeit with obscure multipliers using sharpness in the calculations, but it is only viable against certain monsters. You cannot bring X element weapon against every monster in the game and expect it to always outperform a similarly classed elementless weapon. However, element can cause a weapon to jump a tier or two in the right circumstance. I mentioned this before, but if you are farming the same monster, element weapons are entirely viable in that case. Status is pretty weird because it is considered an element, but it doesn't behave the same. Blast and poison are the only statuses that inflict measurable damage, but calculating the exact damage is difficult to say the least. They both deal differing amount of damage, and apply their status a differing number of times or differing durations depending on what monster you are fighting. Certain monsters are pretty much immune to these statuses, and if they happen to get status, then the damage tends to be minimal. In my opinion, this can cause a weapon to outperform another otherwise identical weapon in damage, but beyond that, it wouldn't cause a mediocre blast weapon to become the quote-unquote best weapon only on the basis of having access to blast. Paralysis and sleep require setup. They do not directly affect your output damage, but they create solid openings to allow more damage to be inflicted. So they would only move a weapon up a tier if your weapon struggles with staying on the monster, or if you can abuse the sleep/stun mechanic. Otherwise, they are the same as non-status weapons in terms of tiering. Affinity is the last factor in determining if a weapon is the best. Many 0 affinity weapons can reach at least 80 affinity with the right setup via Necet, Gemming in Repeat Offender, Tenderizer, and Crit Up, so having affinity on the weapon already isn't required to achieve maximum crit up damage. Having positive affinity tends to have various trade-offs. The higher the affinity, the lower the raw or sharpness length tends to be. It is easier to achieve 100% crits, but your overall damage will be lower than the better weapons with higher raw, hitting 80 affinity with the same or similar crit upsets. The last set of attributes of a weapon do not directly contribute to damage. I'm talking about slots and whether a weapon is a deviant. A good weapon can be run without depending on armor skills, which is why this section is being discussed next to last. The philosophy for this is if you can run an attack up large on one set, you can always run it on the other set, effectively negating any advantage between two weapons. However, when slots come into play, the argument somewhat changes. If all things are equal between two sets, slots can enable one set to get a damage boosting skill over the other, causing it to be the better weapon in that instance. Although slots don't strongly influence a weapon's tiering, it's more of a tiebreaker between two otherwise equal weapons. The last factor for determining if a weapon is good is heavily dependent on style, hunter art, and weapon type. Deviant weapons cause hunter arts to charge faster, meaning you will activate them more over the course of the hunt. Damage from certain hunter arts are invaluable, but not all hunter arts are created equally. Weapons like longsword and switch axe benefit greatly from using deviant weapons because they have powerful, high damage hunter arts. This increases the count of art activations, causing an increase in their overall damage during the hunt, just by using a deviant weapon. Many weapons or styles would rather take absolute readiness over their own weapon-specific arts, so the argument that deviants always increase damage is false in that regard. In the end, it comes down to your playstyle and whether a deviant weapon is good. This was a pretty lengthy discussion of identifying the best weapon, so I suppose I owe it to you, the viewers, to give you my quote-unquote best weapon line in Monster Hunter GU. If you haven't guessed it by now, Rest Razor is arguably the best weapon line in the game for Blademaster. It's not exactly the hottest of takes, but I would like to take a crack at explaining why it's just so darn good in another video. That's all I have for this video. I could spend a similar chunk of time gushing about Rest Razor as well as my honorary mention for best weapon, which is the Valstrax weapon line, but it'll be an ongoing rant that I would like to cut off here. There are a plethora of good weapons, but I would argue that there are a top 10 candidates for each weapon, and swapping between them wouldn't alter your damage all that much. The rest of the weapons just have too many flaws to be considered the best. Anyways, like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I now have a formal Twitter and need all the followers. I'll post channel updates as well as Monster Hunter memes on the Twitter. So, that's it for me. Greedy Knight signing out. Happy hunting!